I'd like to welcome people here. I'm Bill Dutton. I'm director of the Quello Center, and the lecture today, actually a lecture conversation, is going to be given by Alexander Heffner. Alexander is the host of Open Mind. He's a graduate of Harvard and a practicing journalist, and he founded a reincarnation of Open Mind. I watched his grandfather on Open Mind, Richard Heffner. He was a pioneer in public broadcasting. He actually began Open Mind, I think, in 1956. And it was an outstanding program of interviews that featured remarkable guests and lengthy interviews that were quite engaging. And in fact, I even recently looked at the archive of his to find interesting videos on Colin Shaw and other well-known people in the media arena. Because Alexander is bringing back Open Minds, something that has grew in the analog age, and now we're in the digital age with many competing voices and short attention spans, we're told, and a lack of interest in public affairs. I first asked Alexander how he's dealing with the challenges, both in terms of the new audiences, in terms of new business models, new formats. How is he rethinking Open Minds, and how is he rethinking the engagement of a public with serious, high-quality broadcast journalism? And I think that's not just his challenge, but the challenge for many of us interested in the future of the media. I've asked him to speak. He's going to speak briefly, and then we are going to have responses from two of my colleagues here at MSU, Eric Friedman, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the Knight Chair in Environmental Journalism here at MSU, and also the director of the Capitol News Service at MSU. And also Gary Reed, who is one of the associate directors of the Quello Center, I'm proud to say, and also the director of our local public radio and television stations, WKAR. I thought you'd speak maybe 20 to 30 minutes as you wish, and then we'll have a brief responses from Gary and Eric and whatever order you feel. Maybe Eric, you could kick off, I think. And then we'll open it up for any discussion questions. And thank you very much, Alexander. We've worked him very hard today with classes and so forth, so this is his centerpiece. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Well, thanks for being here. I'm delighted to share some thoughts about the Millennial Generation and engage in conversation with you, Eric and Gary. I come after spending a lecture class of maybe over 100 students, introductory course to mass communications. And what mass communications means to this generation is vastly different in terms of transmission, in terms of dissemination, in terms of likes and links, and what's viral being what's newsworthy. And as a host, a young host on public television and a young host generally, I think a lot about this intersection of the millennial generation and the traditional audience of broadcast news. And so I want to talk briefly about these three prongs in what are the guiding areas of interest in my contemporary work: millennials, media expansively, and then how we conceptualize public media, and framing it around a climate of civility and civic consciousness and civic engagement, and what that means for the future of our democracy. So millennials have been touted and bemoaned, have been at the helm of the political process during the 2008 presidential campaign. At the time, I was working on a grassroots-based national student website that was designed to cover the campaign from a millennial youth angle, but really delving into the policy prescriptions espoused by the leading contenders as well as the mainstream candidates like Ron Paul, whose son Rand Paul is now likely a candidate for president in 2016 and has quite a broad appeal, I should add. And the project was later funded as an experimental news bureau to cover the first year of the Obama administration by the Knight Foundation. And so I was saying to the students, I was asking the students if they remember the historic moment in the 2008 campaign, the Will.I.am viral YouTube video, which really was at this intersection of millennial consciousness and the political process, and what modes of communications are going to be the apparatus governing millennials' participation in not only elections, but as consumers of news and information. And it was astonishing to me, and I was somewhat taken aback by the lack of memory of that moment, because just as we might remember the Dean machine and the meetups that were spurred across the country in response to something called a blog. I remember Tim Russert on NBC Meet the Press asking Chris Cillizza and Chuck Todd, what is a blog? And that really, to me, was the evolution from the blog and grassroots meetups of a Craigslist civic commons style, evolving into a moment of a single video galvanizing a critical population that during the primary and general election cycle, President Obama, then candidate Obama, Senator Obama, thought would be a useful tool in his organizing across the primary states and then ultimately in the battleground states. And it has millions and millions, maybe even a billion views at this point. So I'm thinking about millennials and their response to the accusation, allegation, criticism of apathy. And millennials self-reporting that they do read the news, according to one recent survey, that they read content. But do they read the news is the question. And what is content? And if content is being rigged in a sense by a metric-driven model of what is clickbait, then is that really the substantive, meaty fare that should be the fabric, the underpinning, the foundation of news and information? And so I think public media, speaking as a host of a PBS show, and also speaking as someone who's freelanced along the civic beat, interviewing Bob Graham and Sandra Day O'Connor, other civic luminaries in our national political discourse, how can public media be an instrument of not only excellent ratings, as is the case of a Downton Abbey, and increasingly the NewsHour too, but also the kind of news that transcends the viral bite, that has a diminished relevance to our common good. And I did an interview with Newt Minow, former chairman of the FCC, and aide to President Kennedy, who talks about the formation of PBS. And my grandfather too, they both were at the helm of the beginnings of a alternative to commercial television, to an ad revenue-based model. And interestingly, while the internet was once conceived of this vast promise compared to maybe the vast wasteland that Commissioner Minow, Chairman Minow, presaged, was deeply, gravely concerned about, what's the role of a free, flourishing, vibrant fourth estate, truly a fourth estate, if we think of the three other estates, branches of government, as public. So is there a need to transform what is public into something that is indispensable? And it's a question that I ask because public media, I think, is something we need to conceptualize as a Wikipedia, as a Firefox. We can't have a narrow understanding of public media as singularly being an NPR or PBS-driven model. We have to think of it, where is the potential to tap into that vast common good? In the case of Wikipedia, that is a robust community that is the very encyclopedic fabric of an earlier generation in which instead of Googling a term or a country or a capital city, we would consult Encyclopedia Britannica. So the intersection of millennials and public media, I think, is a fascinating topic, and thinking about it more specifically in terms of who are the users, the demographics here, the consumers of news, and is their role going to be as consumers of private commercial product or, more expansively, public media? And so that's a question that I'm contemplating. And I think a lot of folks, both within the traditional Fourth Estate and budding journalistic endeavors like a BuzzFeed and even budding platforms, we obviously know that Facebook and Twitter have unleashed an openness and an environment of if you have a link, you can disseminate it to a huge number of people. You can reveal a truth. You can investigate a story, whether it's a corruption scandal of a congressman or degradation of our environment. There's limitless potential in terms of the mode of transmission, but the public interest in how much we are concerned with individual pieces, that hasn't really been determined. But the BuzzFeed model and the, now it seems like, of even Vine, these new entrepreneurial tech inventions are realizing that even with the vehicle of openness, you need some meat on those bones. And so even in the course, I was pleased to hear a student ask about the integration of a news application, a Discover feature within Vine, so that CNN, Vice, and other news organizations are being integrated. In a sense, social media are really asking young people to pay attention. But we haven't reached a tipping point. I did an interview with one of the co-founders of Twitter, and I asked him about that. His theory is that constraint breeds creativity. And so I asked him, well, should there ever be a constraint on dissemination in terms of what is prosocial, what is civic, and what is valuable to a public commons? And he didn't have a direct answer other than, as the founders of Facebook and Twitter have, commenting that their goal is to open the web, open society, open the entire universe, really. But there is some stake in the game that he has when he said to me off camera, and then I asked him about it on camera, we don't want Twitter just to evolve into crotch selfies and other paraphernalia. And so I think increasingly there is a usefulness in these tech inventions to serve the common good. And I think public media, as we think about it, can be something that is facilitated, strengthened, and more fully embraced, even among the private Facebooks now operating as publicly traded companies. There's no turning back. And these organizations, for the time being, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Twitters, are really the hubs through which we receive information, and you can have even a massive stockpile of financial resources and not cut through that. Unfortunately, it's the public affairs journalists who don't have that and who see the value in perpetuating that in a climate that is very much centered around celebrity. So then we shift into the third prong here of civil discourse. And coming from covering a presidential campaign and now bringing that experience to the show, I think it's imperative for interviewers, journalists, and broadly citizens when they're at town hall meetings to ask questions that don't further polarize us, that don't entrench us in the stereotypes of left, right, blue, red, Republican, Democratic ideology. And I think there are examples of excellent campaign coverage that help you understand a candidate and where he or she comes from. There's no dearth of excellent profiles of the candidates. But when they're at a press conference or a town hall, what overtakes, I think, what trumps, what ultimately dooms the idea of civility is the need to get an answer that has no nuance, that has a clickable bite, that has a headline in the writing. And I don't think this is a private or public media syndrome. I think it's a syndrome of American political journalists. I think increasingly the CJRs and Frank Bruni of the New York Times recently wrote an op-ed that was critical of the Washington Press Corps political journo groupthink. You might be wondering, well, what questions am I raising that could be pernicious? There are a whole boatload of examples, I think, but most recently, a reporter who I like, and he's a gentleman, he asked Scott Walker if he believes in evolution. And this was a question that he would ask him in Iowa. I don't know if at the time he was in front of an evangelical audience or not. But these kinds of black and white yes or no questions are so difficult to frame a conversation with the degree of sophistication that our democracy warrants, quite frankly. And so civility to me is obviously courteousness, and that doesn't mean you can't challenge or interrogate the idea. I've said before that what the open mind tries to accomplish, and what we're going to try to accomplish during this 2016 campaign, is interrogating not the candidate but the ideas, fleshing them out. And if you're on 60 Minutes, often you're doing that in an adversarial tone. Not always. If you're on MSNBC, you're doing that toward a certain affiliation, and the same thing for Fox News. There is a conventional, I think, attitude or favoritism towards what is adversarial today. So I don't think we should be unquestioning, but I think we should be more thoughtful in the way we simply ask questions and follow up on questions, and how we engage with folks on the other side of the fence in the press offices. And I think if you don't play down to them, if you think about it as a tennis match, then they won't play down to you. And that actually, contrary to Bill's comments about my more pessimistic lecture this morning, I think is an optimistic idea and hope and belief in humanity and belief in journalists who I was not too long ago at Drake University, whose communications department invited me to speak there. And the young journalists there, they got it. They understood the point that they don't want their journalism to be truncated to the point of dumb. And how are we poised to get even dumber than we are today? I don't mean in terms of the depth or the resourcefulness or the length of print or, in the case of broadcast, the depth of a documentary or an interview. But I mean in terms of what we're willing to bite and literally consume and digest. And so that syndrome that I alluded to before, coupled with a pushiness towards a quick bite as opposed to a nutritious meal, is what can be damaging. And I think during these past two presidential cycles have been damaging. If you remember individual moments, they can be encapsulated in a single sound and a single question. And oftentimes we think about our elections in terms of individual advertisements or individual flubs on the campaign trail. You think of the Daisy ad, or you think of the 47% remark. There are always going to be highlights and markers, and I'm not arguing against that reality. There are such things as watershed moments, and that deserve to be recognized as such. But when we think about civility, you almost have to be an activist today to want to encourage civility before incivility, and want to raise the questions that are going to create or foster an environment in which consensus is possible. And I think there are going to be opportunities during this 2016 campaign and into the next presidency to for these journalists to come out of the woodwork and be an activist, not in an adversarial way, but with the mission to improve, enrich, and disinfect our democracy. Otherwise, I think that these journalists are going to continue to suffer from what the general public views as untrustworthy, polarized, and they conceive of the media not so differently from the way they conceive their politicians, at least those on television. Reporters historically have, whether it's in Hollywood films or in documentary accounts, have been identified among the bravest, and I wouldn't ever dispute that, among the bravest professionals out there, from Woodward Bernstein on. But I think that unless journalists take an activist attitude in trying to engage the candidates in a case of a campaign around consensus, then I think the job of journalists is going to continue to be questioned in an era of social media where citizen journalists, lay people, anyone can make valid points, whether they're essays or tweets, online. And I want to conceive of a kind of political reporting that can excite millennials, be engrossing, but that is fostering an atmosphere of civility and really viewing something that's contentious in terms of the ideas and the arguments, and filling in the blanks with Americans who can respond and do respond to significant debates in our culture. And you can just look back at the Tea Party movement in response to the Affordable Care Act, that there were real responses to issues, and that was an example of one. But because of the nature of our political discourse, it became a very partisan debate as opposed to an American conversation. And that's hard to come by today. Those are my comments, and I look forward to taking your questions.
It's a lot to respond to, but please, Eric, do you want to begin? And then
Sure. Thank you for the presentation. I'll tell you a little bit about what I agree with and a little bit about what I disagree with. Focus on 2 points. At the beginning, you talked about the difference between something that goes viral and something that's newsworthy. There's a distinction in who makes that determination. It is the millennials or the other users who decide what will go viral. Newsworthy implies some kind of professional standard or criteria or discretionary judgment by editors, news directors, producers, and their understanding of what their audiences are. And so the NewsHour audience may be different from the CBS evening news audience, which may be different from talk radio news audience, but there's some kind of professional triaging of what gets aired or posted. Something goes viral, people like it, they tweet it, they go to YouTube and it shows up. It's not the job of the journalists and the news organizations to determine what goes viral, nor can they. They can speed that process up by reporting. And if the Monica Lewinsky incident happened today rather than when it happened, and we had these means of disseminating information instantaneously, it would have gone viral, if not when Drudge reported it. As soon as the New York Times reported that Drudge had reported it, it would have gone out. The second area, and this is where I'm more pessimistic than you, and I also question whether it's the role of the press to promote consensus. And by press here, I mean news organizations that follow some kind of professional standards and values, whether they're all online or they're affiliated with legacy media. I think the Scott Walker question, whoever asked it, I think that's a valid question. If it was asked by a journalist, the response would go out and other journalists would pick it up, but so would social media users. If it was an ordinary citizen, a voter, a Republican in Iowa who favored a different candidate, the journalists and the news organizations would still report about it. So it's not necessarily who asks the question that determines whether there's civility or incivility. And as a journalist, I think incivility has advantages. Not that we should be impolite and rude and asking questions, but we like conflict, and people like following conflict, whether it's foreign affairs or politics. It's even better if there's some visuals where
People get
as has happened
bloodied.
in some legislatures in the last few years, California, Alabama, where there are slugfests going on. We've had those in Michigan a while back, where one member of the state house threw an ashtray at another member of her own party, hitting him in the head. But we like that. It's newsworthy, and maybe it actually reflects the depth of disagreement on the underlying issues, or maybe it's all political.
Well, as the president of the University of Notre Dame said to me in an interview recently, he thinks fundamentally there are many degrees of moral separation in this country, and so there's not necessarily the consensus that we are aspiring, or I am aspiring to facilitate. I wouldn't say consensus. That might be the outcome, but I don't want to project or predict what civility would bring to the table, other than something that is more newsworthy than content, because I think that despite our interest in conflict, that's Shakespeare. That's just the nature of what amuses, what entertains. I don't think that civility has to be boring. I think civility can be sexy. I think in this climate where we're bombarded with non-educational programming, the impulse, and I think this is why John Oliver on HBO has been successful. If you think about the way that Jon Stewart and John Oliver talk to America, it is much more of I wouldn't even call it conversational FDR fireside chat style, is the Sesame Street, or Mr. Rogers, I'm gonna speak to you. And obviously, in both the case of Oliver and Stewart, they've earned credibility in the eyes of young people, so they can do that. They've been afforded that role. So I would say, though, on your first area of disagreement, I think more and more, even if they are not being asked by Gannett or Hearst or Sulzberger to care about what goes viral. I had dinner with the editor of the Des Moines Register, and we had a nice conversation. I was interested in to what extent she monitors clicks and what goes viral, and how she shares that with her reporters, and if she incentivizes it. And she has not incentivized it yet, but it's something they're considering. But I know other news outlets have incentivized it. And there are lines that have been blurred in such a way that I think that news organizations, especially with corporate parents, with shareholders, think at least this generation coming of age in a newsroom that has been so radically transformed. I think that journalists are growing up with new media in such a way that makes them feel that it's their responsibility to get clicks and likes.
Well, I guess the old adage of public speaking, 3 Bs, be brief, be brilliant, and be gone. I can do the first and third, and I notice that I'm sitting between a couple of heavyweights. So let me just kind of pick up on a couple of pieces, Alexander, that really hit home to me. First off, working backwards is your civility thing. Jim Quello told me many times, Steve Wildman's here, heard it dozens of times as well, that you can disagree without being disagreeable. And as an FCC commissioner, he really lived that. I mean, Quello had the longest confirmation hearing, and he likewise counted Ted Stevens of Alaska and Daniel Inouye of Hawaii just about as far as you get on the political spectrum as his best friends. And the thing that I loved about Quello is that the connection wasn't about the ideology. It was about their shared human experience. And they connected, they bonded because of the war. So picking up on a comment that you had made earlier on, and kind of how I view what we in public media are all about. Mm-hmm. To me, I really think our issue is that of trust. In that when you look at the amount of information that we get, our Twitter feeds, our Facebooks, and so on, there's not enough time to dig in the way fireside chats, right? We've got all of this opportunity, and so having someone that we can trust, someone, particularly as a young person, can trust, to say, this is what I find value in my news. That covenant, to me, is really something that's extremely powerful. The third thought, I guess, that I would throw into the mix is to talk about millennials, and I understand that that's kind of the young, hip thing to do, with no offense to,
sure,
to you. But I have to say that I don't think a millennial needs or deserves any additional attention than a boomer or anyone else. And here's where I'm coming from that, is that from a news organization, and I bow to Eric here, isn't it really about telling stories? And isn't it about telling a story that someone, whether they're a boomer or a millennial or whoever, will believe and trust and be able to move forward? And so from that standpoint, as a general manager of broadcast, I realized that I have to get a younger audience. We all know NET is the big dog station. You know, I'm envious. But we all know, if we look at the graphs, our audience is fading. Our audience is dying away. And we're not doing a very good job replacing that audience. So do we, in a sense, target millennials, or do we target Gen X, Gen Y, whoever, or do we simply come back to the premise of telling good stories, being good, solid people, creating a trustful relationship with our audience, whoever that might be, and let that come about? And what cued me when you talked about it, the early days of PBS, 1970 for NPR and PBS. I remember those days. But it was really simple then. We had CBS, NBC, ABC, and then the entire country knew, right, that there was a financial difference. Today, we're just another signal. So to come to that, if we can figure out a way as a university community, as a public broadcast community, as led by our journalists, if we can figure out a way to regain that trust, to me, there's value there, and I feel better about the focus of our future.
Right. Well, I think that objective is very much tied into how you preserve public media and guarantee its survival going forward. The idea that there is something qualitatively in terms of the storytelling, but also in terms of the priorities, different. There's something qualitatively different about that signal, or whatever your station, our stations collectively morph into in the future. And so there's no doubt that even if distribution has gone down, newspapers, just by their very nature, historically have been the entity of media cultivating the civic norms through A1 stories about news, and so this whole shift of the New York Times and at the LA Times too, reporters are no longer pitching for A1. They don't have the A1 meetings. They have, I said this earlier, they're having meetings on who gets better placement on the web. Again, tying into what's viral, what's not. But I think PBS shares the mission of newspapers of old, and maybe some contemporary papers, in terms of what still is on A1, and that doesn't mean that you can't tell exotic stories or get into entertainment, comics, and things, sports, things that people historically go to after glimpsing at the cover of a magazine or a newspaper. But I think it's imperative to recultivate those norms because the majority of young people who are getting their news through aggregated sources, and I don't mean mostly socially aggregated sources, there's no civic consciousness that is kind of a mantle that's built on from social media news reading. as far as the comment about millennials, I don't disagree with you in the idea that good journalism is good journalism, and I don't think you have to create a whole new brand to appeal to younger people. You have to live in their space of Facebook and Twitter. That's been well established in order to get the eyes and ears. If young people view or listen to your coverage of the news as much as they rely on Google and then Wikipedia for anything to search, then you're in a good position. Which is why, again, I think Wikipedia has been and should continue to be studied perceptively in order to kind of understand how you can get the substance of an encyclopedia into a news story that's going to resonate and that's going to get young people to believe that they can read something that's not about Kim Kardashian or the most recent thriller movie, and it will be engaging as well as helping inform the citizenry. That is the basis of our democracy. My approach with the open mind in terms of connecting to millennials has been to try to discover new thinkers and emerging voices who may not have done television with the frequency of folks that you find on the tube, or and so that I know that Bill Moyers has also, who retired recently, expressed that is something that he tried to achieve on the air, not only giving airtime to philosophies and perspectives and thoughts that are out of the mainstream or novel or inventive, but folks who don't make the rounds, so to speak, and so that's an exciting part of the work that I do. And I also think young people are going to increasingly be victims or celebrants of the new media age. And it's important to step back and think about how new media, social media are affecting us physically, emotionally, psychologically. And so some of those questions are ones that I raise in programs that I do, because we often are on the front end, so to speak, of buying something on Amazon Prime or streaming something on Netflix, but we're not really thinking about the whole privacy issue or any of the other issues that are at play when the latest gadget or platform or website emerges. I think those are some of the topical areas that, as young people become aware of the consequences of this new media age, they're going to be listening to and interested in. And then there's going to be a backlash. I'm not saying we're going to go from analog to digital back to analog, but there's going to be a fuller awareness of what digital is and what should be preserved from analog.
Couple quick questions. In our traditional broadcast television, we're locked into the 30, 60-minute type time frame. Given the millennial difference, what do you find is the optimal timepiece for?
It's something we're still experimenting. Okay. But I would say that I don't know if a minute is preferable to 3 minutes, but I know that broadcast television is being reduced to the image, the JPEG, and when folks trot out social media art and graphics to promote a show, they often are reducing it to its simplest form, just like a photo of, for example, The Tonight Show or shows that inherently have a greater appeal to younger folks. They are reducing it to the most basic form they can. I don't know, in terms of a bite of the open mind, we've experimented and have used shorter snippets of what we find to be profound moments during interviews. I can't tell if that, and the sample is small because we don't have the audience of a Tonight Show, but I can't tell if what the optimal length is right now, but I know that if you're going to get young people to watch the 30 minutes, that it's likelier if you have available a minute or 3 minutes that they'll end up watching more of the 30 minutes. It's just the nature of the attention span.
So shifting a little bit,
Yeah.
give me your take on why Brian Williams' fabrication is considered basically a major sin, and yet Bill O'Reilly isn't held to that same standard. Balance the...
I'm sure this is something you've heard before, that NBC News is a different operation from Fox News, and
we know it's different, but perceptually, at a millennials level.
Oh, at a millennials level, that's an additional wrinkle that I haven't really contemplated. If you sample millennials' perspectives, I don't know if millennials, because I think the polls that have been done show that, by and large, Fox News viewers aren't affected. If anything, this has bolstered his ratings and given him more credibility to his viewers. You're talking about an audience that is opinion driven. I think that would probably cut through into the millennial state of mind too about that. I know that, but in both instances, not a huge number of young people watch either the nightly news or the O'Reilly factor.
Could I put you on this issue of that Gary raised about what's so special about the millennials?
Sure.
And I thought it's because we think that the millennials are turned off to public affairs and news and quality journalism, and so we think we have to talk. And they're a large segment of the population, and the future of democracy may rest in. But is that not? Is it always been the case that that age group is not really following the news? And are we exaggerating the current contemporary situation, or is it always been this way?
Well, if you measure it by voting,
Okay.
which is one way to do it, to me that's an important way to do it. The numbers have steadily declined ever since 18-year-olds got the right to vote. So if you just, and historically, young people have not voted in midterm elections, but if you look at presidential contests, ever since what would have been Nixon's second term. If you look at it, it's been a downward spiral, with an exception that young people tend to be more engaged and vote at an increased level in the swing states, and you could attribute that to a greater number of appearances by candidates, a greater number of ads on television, and a greater grassroots mobilization movement especially around campuses in Florida and Ohio and Virginia. I think my attitude towards it is that it's an open book in terms of what millennial empowerment can be. And certainly on the climate change issue, there's been, and also on the kind of new civil rights issues, there's been a political mobilization coalescing around some of these issues. So if you're asking, have young people historically always sort of been apathetic? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I think that there's been a deterioration over time in terms of what, being able to define civics in the context of our citizenship. But I mean, maybe it was all a myth and it was all a fabrication that families did sit and watch Cronkite, and that was being force-fed. And it was probably being force-fed to the parents too, who would have rather watched Scandal or something else if they could have. That's what I mean. It wasn't. I don't think the reprioritization of our news values is simply a result of the decline of newspapers. Broadcast in its inception had a priority system, and that didn't favor celebrity, and that wasn't inherently biased. If anything, it was all white men reading the news, despite the fact that someone as senior statesman in the news industry, a Cronkite or a Murrow would, get on and say something anti-war. In the case of Cronkite, I mean, generally, these men weren't taking any positions. And so the question is, to me, not whether they have always been disengaged. It's how do you address the severe drought of disengagement? Because there's no question that there's a lot of disengagement today.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Eric,
Oh,
did you-
Alan,
Yeah, I was just going to, related to this, and so I'm going to offer a statement and then Alexander, if you react. The idea of millennials or boomer or anything is not it's not only totally useless, it's counterproductive. And I'll use the millennials. I work here in this building with 18 to 24-year-olds, which are, 22-year-olds, undergraduates. My daughters are in the last third of millennial. There couldn't be any greater difference between my late 20s and the 18 and 22-year-old kids I deal with here. Their patterns for accumulating information, their behaviors, their friends' behaviors.
There couldn't be anything different?
It could be greater. Even, I'm
Oh,
probably closer
yeah,
than millennials
sure.
than they are. And so the problem is, you take any, and you can go to the boomers. I was born in '48. My experience in the '60s was entirely different than a late boomer born in 1959. And so 15 years is huge period of time to try and lump into one group.
Right, but
And the change has become even greater now. And so what happens is, I hear people talking about looking for things that go viral. Something that goes viral, if you get 10 million views, that's a big deal. 10 million views wouldn't keep a TV show on 25 years ago. And so what's happened is the technology itself has emphasized the dispersion, the variance amongst population, rather than the central tendency. And we continue, because we want to make money off of this, concentrating on, well, the majority of the millennials. There is no such thing as a majority of the millennials. You target a millennial, or you target somebody who's 34, somebody who's 18, somebody who's 23. And so this very idea, which comes out of the press, right? It comes out of academics who study, is counterproductive. We can't understand the public when we clump them into such large groups that we ignore the variation within those large groups.
Well, I disagree. I think that I lament the fact that we have to classify anything or anyone,
Sure.
right? But
Well, you just-
but we can't, and TV networks and even newspapers. There's been obviously a business model that's been questioned, and there's been a certain demographic that's been reliably consuming media, and so as we've established for kind of the formula that you're aspiring to achieve from a business model. That's not why I am talking about millennials.
Yeah.
I'm talking about millennials because collectively 18 to 30-year-olds vote. One of five of those folks will vote in a presidential election year or a midterm election year. It could be, based on the most recent studies, even worse. So it's not simply a historical trend now. These young people in that millennial group are really decisive in their volunteerism, in being active in campaigns, and I think that's historically
Right.
true.
Yeah, yeah.
And so,
I don't think we're disagreeing. I'm simply saying it's a different way to get a 34-year-old vote than to get an 18-year-old vote.
well, I understand. If you're searching for
And
like
when you
a,
concentrate on the group, you're missing that difference.
right,
Not just
well,
you, I mean,
but I think you're absolutely right about that. And I'm not disagreeing with you at all in terms of the differences, because you have a teenager growing up today with Vine that's different from Facebook, that's different from the laptop with wireless in its inception, that's different from a dial-up, that's different from just having a computer without internet, the word processing generation. And when I was growing up in middle school and high school, it was much more reliant on print still, with internet just being phased in to households and certainly high speed. So there are definitely distinctions, but the distinction that groups them together is their lack of voting. So I've done a lot of reporting on that, and generally older people vote with the greatest consistency. But so my interest in large measure is I think to feel confident in voting you have to be somewhat informed, and I think a lot of people don't vote because they may listen to the radio or the news on occasion. They're either apathetic or disgusted or disengaged as a result of that small amount of exposure, or they just don't have the time. That's what you hear a lot. Don't have the time. So young people are the coalition that I think can invite changes in our political process, which I think, I don't know if you said the boomers or were protesting, and when you think about Vietnam, it was a group, right? But if you're thinking about the greatest generation, if you're thinking about what the calling is, it's certainly not requisite military service. It's not. I mean, there are blips. There's AmeriCorps. There's the Peace Corps. But I would like to see us not really focus on millennials versus baby boomers versus greatest generation. But I think the situation is such with millennials' lack of participation in our democracy that a lot of people say that, citing Churchill, that you become more conservative as you grow up, face the realities of the real world. Well, this generation, it's not that they're turning liberal to conservative. We're just waiting to see if they actually take an active role in our democracy. And the answer thus far has been a small group has. Highly educated people tend to vote, and non-educated people don't. I mean, that's a real correlation that has been studied. So there are definitely differences among college-age millennials today and then millennials who are 18 to 30 years old. And eventually, that term is going to become totally obsolete, because this generation of middle schoolers who are using Vine to communicate as opposed to SMS, I don't think we're going to call them millennials. No one has really identified yet what comes next. But for my purposes, it's not the purposes of trying to get more millennials to watch The Open Mind, although that's great. My interest kind of derives from a civic orientation. Look, there's a problem with this subset. How do we try to engage this subset in a way that is going to be they're going to respond to?
Eric?
Brett, 2 quick points. One, to build on your laundry list of reasons why millennials say they don't vote, is that it's inconvenient. It's not just a question of time, but in most states, including this one, it's hard to even get an absentee ballot unless you're over 60 or you're disabled or you're going to be out of town. And for political reasons, the powers that be in state legislatures have not mandated online registration, online voting. So they're used to everything. You order a pizza, you do it online, it shows up at your house.
Yeah.
Why can't you vote that way? And the second, your earlier point about clicks and incentives, news organizations have been doing that forever. They look at circulation figures, they look at Nielsen ratings. It's just now it's trickled down to individual producers of the content and to their particular stories. And if you're a reporter, and MLive is one of the organizations, it's a Newhouse subsidiary that counts clicks, and you're covering some little suburbs out there, and you're the MLive reporter who's covering Big Ten football, how can you compare the numbers?
Right.
And I used to joke with a friend at MLive that the way you get your clicks is no matter what your story is, you get the word Spartan and you get the word Obamacare in the lead in that first paragraph. And in a meeting that had nothing to do with this and this, the local school board voted to renew the teacher's contract. That's all you need. Doesn't matter what comes below.
Yeah.
And we all fall for it. I use CNN.com as my homepage. And I fall for it all the time. Mayor arrested in corruption scam. I click on it, and it's somebody in Caracas. Like, okay, it might be mildly interesting, but I'm hoping it's Detroit or New York or Chicago or Washington. And it's not the celeb names, it's kind of the power title or the job.
Right. Well, I think that I'm sure based on this particular editor's feedback that there is a recognition that of what you're describing, that a sewage problem in a small town, unless it becomes infects Detroit's water, isn't well, Detroit. I don't know if it's a huge migration or everyone's immigrating back now, it seems. But that's the point. So I understand that. I think the predominance of what we perceive as viral is not necessarily news. I'm not going to say that from your example of kind of adversarial can be news, it's conflict. I agree, but there's a certain point at which I think corruption scandals tuned out, or maybe when you get someone throwing a shoe at you at a news conference, that rises to the level of. So I'm not sure how this generation can respond to the reality you're describing, other than there is some element of that just being the status quo. So there's the hope, though, that these new forms of engagement can be utilized in ways that are going to convene a kind of town hall. And that goes to your first point, which is I have long said that we need to bring up to speed our democracy, because we do e-commerce, we do electronic mail, we deposit money into our bank account, we buy groceries, we virtually do everything online. But the one thing we haven't gotten online is our democracy in a way other than raising money for candidates. So I actually think that your 2 points, even though they were presented in an unrelated light, they're related, because there is no impetus driving us towards, I wouldn't say consensus, but just some functional democracy. And if there were as many people clamoring for that as clamoring for, or willing to read something that is totally unrelated to the health of our democracy. And look, who wants to hear about the health of our democracy if it's presented as a boring question? I guess if you think inherently democracy and health are boring, then I don't know. Other than when John Oliver or Jon Stewart inject humor, what I try to do is put people at ease in a climate of conversation. There are, the different styles of trying to do that.
Can I just, I think this issue of clicks is absolutely central, and this idea that there's nothing new about following, if it bleeds, it leads, is not a new idea. It's always been there. But the fact that people can now see what we read means that no longer can the
Precisely,
classified ads and sports carry high quality editorials and journalism. So we know that there's not the great interest that we thought there might have been for real news or high quality news. And so either we have to figure out a completely new business model to support that, or we have to take a very elitist view of democracy, that we only have a very small proportion of people who are really interested in serious news reporting. That's not a very popular thing to say, but that the fact of the matter is, if we look at trying to have mass popularity with what we're doing, it seems like a lost cause. But if we have an expectation that we've got a small percentage of the public who will consume real news and serious news, well then maybe there's a business there. But we can't be competing with, I don't know. Yeah.
Bill, that boat left a long time ago.
I know. Well,
in 1992, we put out a collection of essays in the Newspaper Research Journal about the future of news. And a fellow named Blankenberg, who's now retired, wrote about whether or not newspapers had become a class medium. And they had. They wrote themselves out of it because the level of writing in newspapers is so high that at least 30% of the population is not comfortable reading them. So you've cut out a third of the people to begin with by writing at a college level, which is what they write at, because there's plenty of studies about that. So yeah, I think that boat's left. And
so we've already come to that point where
yeah. The question is, how big is the percentage?
Yeah.
That's an educational process.
Right.
You can teach people to be involved if you teach them they should be involved.
Right.
So yeah, we have not been a democracy when it comes to news for a long time, for decades now.
Right.
It has been an elite thing. Now the studies of political communication indicate, going back 75 years, because I'm working on an article about this, that the media have never been changing minds, they've been reinforcing positions. That goes back to the 1940 study called People's Choice, and it continues to be the case. People select to read what is consistent with their beliefs. There is a smaller percentage, maybe 30%, probably not that high, that will change from one election to the next, but it's not necessarily because of what they read or view. It has to do with their family, their friends, what they read and view, and this really complex relationship that we don't understand well yet. So I'm sorry, Bill. I'm sorry.
It won't be the first time I've been decades behind the news.
Now the thing is, things can change. We're not going to be measuring clicks forever. Now the interest is engagement, because clicks don't predict how people respond to advertising very well. That's the advantage of having all of this data. So clicks don't work from the perspective of the advertiser. They're looking for engagement. Right now the best engagement measure is time. How long are people staying?
Right, and that's what I meant. I
Yeah.
mean, in the extension of what the interactivity there is.
Yeah, exactly. And so if you can engage someone and get them to come back, then you're going to be able to sell those people to advertisers. Just clicking now, because advertisers only stay dumb for a few years, and then they realize that it's all clickbait and that they're not getting anything out of it because they can study it. API now has an app that they're using with 40 newspapers that follows everybody that reads everything off of those websites and through their apps. And they classify them into categories, and it's relatively new, but it's going to provide huge amount of data that will answer this, because they've got people of all ages looking at it. So the data is going to tell us more, but the data is still early, still young. So I'm optimistic that maybe things will get better in the future, however we do that. But maybe I'm just an optimist like you, just a little bit less so.
Okay.
What are the metrics on your show? You get Nielsen's and
I don't even really. I'm fortunate, because I don't know about your station, but the creative control and putting out a really terrific interview is what takes entire precedence. And I think that's, I don't know if you would say that's true of your station, but if you have the funding, and I was talking about this with students earlier, and a lot of independent production companies raise money through foundations and individuals, and that's how the majority of non-headline programming gets done. And so that's different from when you're viewing or creating a commercial entity, and the shareholders are the ones you're serving. And as I said to the students earlier, that luxury of creative control comes in large measure to media philanthropists. They may care about issues, but they're not investing in you on the public media side because they want to make a buck. Whereas folks outside of public media, as we understand it, are deeply interested in how the news or content merged with social can create the and that's why you see increasingly sites that are combining those ideas of content. Here's a great news story. Here's an advertisement for this product. In many cases, it's not really like a news story. It's more like embedded content, like native advertising.
Do you get feedback on the programs? How do you?
Yeah, people write, people
hear?
email.
People write.
People write.
Yeah.
People email.
Yeah.
People call.
Okay.
The reason I ask, we have a weekly half-hour political talk show. It's called Off the Record. And we track it. We get the Nielsen numbers. And what I know about my Nielsen numbers on Off the Record is it does really well with women 45 plus. The interesting part of the show, however, is that when the show finishes, we do Off the Record Extra. And so we stream it online. And those online numbers that we get tell us that it's pretty much of a 25, 34-year-old group, and predominantly male that we get in from there. So those two sort of very theoretically divergent pieces are really based around the technology that's used. So the 25, 34s online are all of the staffers downtown. So we're in the state capitol, and the staffers are assigned to watch, online to see who the guest on this week's Off the Record, what they said. Give me a brief. When we air it Friday night, clearly everybody else is gone, but middle-aged women find a great deal of interest in that show. So from a general management standpoint, because we don't have the philanthropic giving level that
Right.
why I'm envious of NET. We have to really look at it and say, how can we position it? We've made content changes, we've made stylistic changes to that, and also in our online on-demand streaming, we will take little snippets out of there, trying to get to that issue of length of time.
Yeah, well, that aspect is consistent with my experience, which is, and I can actually literally see it because not the staffers downtown, but friends and contemporaries online. So, historically the show has had a more mature audience. So we have that hybrid too. And when I do see a comment left on Facebook or an email from someone who's, or at least I'm presuming, viewed it on television, that kind of informs how we might alter what we're doing.
So I guess to carry that out, the question that we always face content-wise is, are we broadcasting or are we narrowcasting? Yeah. So when we start to focus in on the people who comment or complain or whatever, what's that boundary there? Yeah. And we talk about that. Maybe not daily, but multiple times a week.
Right. Well, on a public affairs show that is pretty broad, we're broadcasting but I definitely enjoy and see the value in and implement suggestions, however they may come in. Because of the nature of the show, I get a lot of pitches, but I don't get a lot of viewers saying, this person would be an excellent guest. Maybe it's because they like the goods that they're getting, and because it's a pretty diverse roster of people that comes on.
Okay. Well, I hope this lecture, when we put it online, will up everyone's rating. But this is such an important topic, and it's great. Thank you very much for our respondents and our speaker, and I really appreciate this.
Thanks for being here.
I'll let you know when this is available.
Okay.
For you, okay. But thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.